Today we're stepping back in time to the stylish 1960s with Simplicity 9466, a vintage step-in dress pattern that's as charming now as it was then. This design features a classic collar, a fitted bodice, and a bias-cut midriff that flows into a skirt with a neatly stitched pleat below the waist. The double-breasted front button closure adds the perfect retro detail, and you can choose short sleeves or go sleeveless for a different vibe. For my version, I've sewn view A with the sleeves using a beautiful 100% linen twill from the Linen Lab, and I finished it off with vintage brass buttons for a look that's wonderfully true to the original pattern cover. In this full tutorial, I'll take you step by step through the entire process so you can create your own timeless dress that's both wearable and full of vintage charm. The right and left side of the dress will be constructed slightly differently to incorporate buttonholes into the right front. Here is my right front bodice piece, and I'll place the right front midriff piece right sides together with this piece. Pin to attach. We're going to sew from one outer edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the first dot, backstitching to secure. Then we'll start our stitching again at the next dot for the buttonhole, backstitching to secure, continuing along the seam to the end once again with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim this seam to about 3/8 of an inch. And I'll clip into the curved areas. For the buttonhole opening, I'm going to clip from the outer edge to the dot, making sure not to clip through the stitching line. For both dots. Then I'll press the seam allowance upward, and for the buttonhole opening, I'll press that portion of the seam allowance downward. For the seam allowances that are pressed upward, I'm going to finish those seam allowances together. I'll also finish the small portion of the pressed down buttonhole area seam allowance along its small raw edge. Place the right front midriff piece right sides together with the right front skirt piece, and pin in place. Then we'll sew this seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from the outer edge to the first dot, backstitching to secure, starting again at the next dot, backstitching to secure to the opposite side of the seam, in the same exact way as we did to attach the right bodice piece. Then I'll trim the seam, clip into the curves, and snip to the dots. Press the seam allowance upward, and press that tiny seam allowance for the buttonhole area downward. I'll finish this seam in the same way as I did for the top, finishing the main seam allowances together and this tiny buttonhole seam allowance separately. I've gone ahead and followed the same steps to construct the left front side of the dress, just omitting the buttonhole openings. Here is my back bodice piece, and I've marked the darts onto the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'll pin them in place. Sew the darts from the top edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so you can tie them in knots. Press the darts toward the center back. Place the back midriff right sides together with the back bodice piece and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'll trim my seam allowance, clip the curves, and press the seam allowance upward. And I'll finish those raw edges together. Place the back midriff right sides together with the top of the back skirt piece and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, trim the seam, clip into the curves, finish the raw edges together, and press the seam upward, in the same exact way as we did for the previous seam. Place the front and back dress pieces right sides together along the shoulder seams and pin in place. Sew both shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the seams to about 3/8 of an inch, finish the raw edges, and press those seams toward the back of the garment. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of your collar pieces. Then place them right sides together and pin the center seam. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Repeat to sew the remaining collar facing pieces together along the center seam and press the seam open. Place these pieces right sides together and pin the outer and bottom curved edge. Sew the outer and bottom edges with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the seam allowances and clip those bottom corners. And also snip into the curves of the bottom edge. Turn your collar right side out, poking out the corners. Then we'll baste the open bottom edges together. Here are my front and back dress pieces opened out at the shoulder seams with the right side of the fabric facing me. Place the collar right sides together with the dress, placing the outer short edges of the collar at the dot transferred onto the front bodice piece. Also align the center backs and pin in place. Add more pins as needed, then baste the collar in place. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your front and back facing pieces. Then we'll sew our buttonholes into the right front facing piece as marked from the pattern. Then I'll place my facing pieces right sides together along the shoulders and pin in place. Sew both shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now we're going to finish the outer edges of the facing all the way around. I'm going to start the finishing stitches at the dot indicated on the right front facing piece. At that dot, I'm going to press that raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Then I'll edge stitch close to the raw edge, pressing that all the way around. Continue for the outer edge of the back facing, all the way to the bottom edge of the left front facing piece. Now those outer facing edges are finished, and for the bottom short edge of your left front facing, you can finish the raw edge in your preferred method. I went ahead and used my serger there. Place the facing right sides together with the dress neckline. Pin in place along the entire right front, along the back neckline, and the left front from the top to the dot. Now that the facing is pinned all the way around the front and neckline, I'm ready to sew it in place with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'll start at the bottom raw edge of the right front facing, sewing to the top and pivoting around the neckline. Then I'll continue sewing down the left facing to the dot, backstitching to secure. On the left front, we're going to clip from the seam allowance to the small dot on the dress material only. Then we're going to trim the seam allowances for the section that we just sewed. Also clipping those top sewn corners. And clip into the curves of the neckline. Turn the facing to the inside of the garment, poking out those top corners, and give it a good press. On the inside at the shoulder seams, I'm going to sew the facing to the seam allowance, just with the needle and thread, being careful not to allow the needle to exit the outside of the dress. Repeating for the facing at both shoulder seams. Here are my buttonholes for the right front facing, and we want to secure the area around the buttonholes on the facing to the seam allowances underneath, making sure that your sewn buttonhole sits right on top of the buttonhole opening on the right front dress. I'm going to do this with a needle and thread sewing through the facing and through those seam allowances, just with a running stitch. I'm going to repeat for my second buttonhole, just making it a priority that the needle doesn't exit the outside of the dress. Now we're going to place the left front dress right sides together with the right front facing from the point that we started our finishing stitches. Align the dots and pin in place right sides together. Once you've aligned the pieces at the dot, continue pinning the left dress to the right front facing all the way to the bottom of the dress, aligning the raw edges. We'll sew from the bottom of the dress with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the dot. Once we get to the dot, we'll pivot our stitching and sew through the single layer of the left front facing for about 1 inch. This will help secure those stitches at the dot. And I went ahead and finished the raw edges together for the section that we just sewed. Now we'll pin the side seams from the underarm to the bottom of the dress on both sides. Sew both side seams from the underarm to the bottom of the dress with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Finish the raw edges together and press the seams toward the back of the dress. For the sleeve, we're going to sew basting stitches along the top edge from outer notch to outer notch so that we can ease it into the armhole. Before I sew the underarm seams of the sleeve, I'm going to pre-press the hem to the wrong side by its full hem allowance. Then I'll open that out, and additionally, I'll press the outer raw edge to the wrong side by a 1/4 inch. I'll open out both of my creases and fold the sleeve in half right sides together and pin the underarm. Sew that seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together and press the seam toward the back of the sleeve. Then I'll fold up my hem creases to the wrong side along the pre-pressed lines and pin my hem in place all the way around. Edge stitch close to the upper inner fold all the way around to complete the hem. Repeat this process to create both sleeves. Place the sleeve into the corresponding armhole right sides together, aligning the underarm and the notches, and pin in place. Pulling the basting stitches that you sewed into the top of the sleeve will help ease your fabric into the armhole. Pin in place. Sew the sleeve into the armhole with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and repeat to attach both sleeves. I'm going to hem the bottom of the dress in the same way as I did for the bottom of the sleeves. I pre-pressed the hem allowance to the wrong side, and my full hem allowance here was 1¼ inches. Then additionally, I pressed the outermost raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. I'll fold those folds in place and pin my hem all the way around. Then I'll edge stitch all the way around to complete the bottom hem. For the finishing touches, I've gone ahead and added a garment label to my facing at the center back. I've made sure that my center fronts for the front bodice pieces are aligned. And under each of my buttonholes, I've marked the button placement. And I'll sew those first 2 buttons underneath the buttonholes. I'll sew the outside buttons at the markings from the pattern piece. Then I'll sew the first set of snaps underneath the outside top button. sewing the snap in place so that the stitches don't exit the front of the garment. Sew the remaining 2 snaps on the inside of the top area. Once again, making sure that the center fronts are aligned. Sew snaps so that these center edges stay flat in place on the inside. I've made markings along those edges and their corresponding spots, and I'll sew the snaps in place. And now the dress is complete. Thank you for joining me for this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.